All
right, I'd like to welcome everyone to our second to last webinar series, this being hosted by the History of Economics Society and the University of Lyon. We've had a number of webinars so far looking at reproductive rights, contraception and abortion in the history of economic thought and in contemporary context. And so we are very happy to have Melanie Guldi here today from the University of Central Florida. She's done research on topics such as birth rates, teen pregnancy, and reproductive health. And her research was cited in the amicus brief sent to the Supreme Court by Economist, right, for Dobbs versus Jackson. And so it's exciting, right, to hear this firsthand and to see sort of what the contemporary situation is like. So I will turn it over to Melanie.
right.
And stop making noises on my computer.
Thank you, Marianne and Rebecca, for inviting me to present on this topic. It's something I've been thinking about for quite a while. It was actually part of my dissertation, and it's been quite some time since I did that. So it's something I think is important to think about in the current context. And I think even though, I don't have to convince an audience of historians of this, but I think we can learn lessons from history to inform current policy debate. All right, so I always do like a little brief outline just so we know where we're going to be going. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on the changes in the 1960s and 1970s that affect legal access to abortion and contraception, in particular the pill. And in this talk, I'm going to primarily focus on women who would have been age 14 to 20 at the time of the changes. And I'm going to be asking questions. How did these changes affect access to abortion, access to the pill, or both? And we'll be thinking about use as well. It's a little harder to measure use for these things for these women of this age during this time period. So there's less evidence on that. So primarily, I'm going to be looking at things that we can measure. So fertility, marriage, career education. I'm going to talk a little bit about selection and thinking about health outcomes as well and longer term outcomes. Okay, so prior to 1960, abortion existed. I don't have to convince this audience. I think we had a talk on that, or we will at some point soon. But things changed in the US on May 21st, 1959. This is when the American Law Institute first released a draft proposal of the model penal code, and in particular, the part of the code relating to abortion. The US American Law Institute had decided to look at the model penal code carefully starting in 1951. And it was a big reform of the criminal code. And it wasn't until the late 50s that they turned to abortion. In 1962, they released a final draft of these reforms. And in this draft, they recommended states liberalize existing criminal abortion laws to permit abortions in licensed hospitals, in cases of rape or incest, physical abnormality, and for the physical or mental health of the mother. Prior to this reform, the state laws varied. Some states had legal abortion for some exceptions along the lines of the ALI reform. For example, in Arizona, they had a law in 1956 that allowed abortion if it were to save the life of the mother. But a lot of the scholarship argues that the decriminalization effort led by ALI led to a flood of changes, which I'm going to show you in a second, and maybe ultimately led the way for decriminalizing abortion later. Okay, so I'm going to show you birth rate, I have a graph up here. It's birth rate by conception year. And I've just averaged the birth rate for ages 15 to 21 at birth. And in the bottom here, we have conception year. So the assumption here is that if you've given birth in 1968, you likely would have conceived in 1967 and faced laws in 1967. So why 1967? Well, this was the first year a state adopted the ALI code into their state law. And Colorado did this in April, and then California and North Carolina adopted the laws just a few months later. Between 1968 and 1972, a number of states also reformed their abortion laws along these lines. And then in 1970 to 1972, there were a handful of states that even more liberalized their abortion laws. I think when Caitlin Myers did her talk, she probably went over this in more detail. But essentially, these states adopted laws that would be considered equivalent to what we saw post-Roe. And then, of course, in 1973, we enter the post-Roe era. Not going to focus quite as much in this talk on the post-Roe era, only in the early 70s. As far as legal access to abortion, you know, of course, if you were living prior to any of these reforms, access to legal abortion was very limited. There were a handful of places you could get an abortion under a very narrow set of circumstances. After these reforms started rolling in, and then of course after Roe versus Wade, if a pregnancy, you know, fell into one of these conditions, or if it was after Roe versus Wade, then access was really regulated by the legal age of majority, medical consent laws, mature minor doctrine, and age-specific abortion laws. So some states had in their statutes laws that were specifically addressing abortion. This created differential access by age of women seeking an abortion. And so this is what a lot of the research I'm going to talk about today will explore. As far as contraception, we have, you know, a parallel timeline. Prior to 1960, of course, contraception in some form existed, but 1957 was really a turning point. The contraceptive pill was approved for use in the US, but for controlling menstruation. It wasn't until 1960 that it was actually approved for use as a contraception. However, in 1960, not all women had legal access to contraception due to mainly the Comstock laws. In short, these banned the sale and advertisement of contraception, which limited access to contraception. And of course, that also limited use of contraception. 1965 was a watershed moment for the birth control pill. In 1965, the US Supreme Court basically paved the way for married women to access and use contraception, including the pill. Some states allowed younger unmarried women access, but this was not the case for all states. I do think it's important to highlight that during this period of time, the average age of marriage was less than 21. And many states treated married women as adults for the purposes of medical consent. So these individuals would have had access to the pill with a Griswold decision. I also want to highlight the median age at first marriage was 20.6. So that means half of women below 20.6 were married. So that's or half of women getting married were below the age of 20.6. So I think that's something quite different than contemporary times. In 1972, the US Supreme Court decision Eisenstadt versus Baird allowed unmarried adult women to access or use contraception. And this was a big deal for all of the women who weren't married or who weren't over the age of 21. So we think this is a time when access expanded for younger women. And so in the post-1972 period, whether a woman would have, or a young woman would have had access to this form of contraception would be regulated by mature minor doctrine, medical consent laws, and other state-specific laws related to contraception. When we think about the model, right, if we think about women making decisions related to abortion or pill access, we think about, that these are very intertwined decisions. If you only focus on the fertility decision, you might have a fertility decision tree like the one I've shown here, where we think someone has a fertility intention and they think whether they may or may not have sex, and then conditional on that, they decide maybe before or after whether or not to use contraception. They may become pregnant, they may end up having a birth, and so forth. But layered on top of this is decisions related to marriage and relationships and family formation, other decisions related to career and education. And it's something that happens down the line in the fertility tree. If someone unexpectedly becomes pregnant, right, this could influence a marriage decision. It could influence a career and education decision. And having more certainty on this stage with regard to fertility, knowing you have better confidence that one won't become pregnant when using contraception, that may change the calculus of the decisions related to marriage or career and education. And so I think, having greater access to reproductive control is important for all of the decisions shown here. As far as identifying the effects, we often, in economics, we like to talk about causal impacts. And so I think it's important to think about what, variation is being used to identify these effects, and can we consider this variation to be exogenous? What I have here are just maps of what the policies were at a particular point in time. So these are for someone who would have been 17 years old at the time of conception, 18 at the time of birth. And the left map is for pill access and the right map is for abortion access. And I think one thing to note is for a young woman, they may have access to one but not the other, or they may have access to both. And so for abortion, the timing of the changes in legal access were unexpected. So prior to Roe, the ALI reforms, you might argue those are potentially endogenous because it's sort of a state action to adopt, changes to their penal code. But the Roe decision really was contentious. It was a 5-4 decision, and who had access to abortion after that, really, it fell back to things like mature minor doctrine and things like this. So I think this is considered a little bit less problematic. For the pill, the timing and the discovery of the pill, we think this was exogenous. There was money spent to discover a pill, but exactly when that happened and when the FDA would say it was okay to sell the drug, those are a little bit unclear, exactly the timing of that. And then on top of that, layering the Supreme Court cases, the Griswold decision for married women, and then later the Eisenstadt Baird decision for unmarried women, and then changes in age of majority. These are all things that I think we can attribute some credibility to this being an exogenous change. Like I said, I'm going to focus on young women. There's good reasons to focus on young women. Delaying first birth can have a big impact on the trajectory of what happens going forward. And so having better control over the timing of first birth might be kind of more salient for that age group. As far as identifying the effects, the first paper that I think really put this all together was Golden and Katz, 2002. Now they focused more on the birth control pill and not as much on abortion, but they identified variation coming from age of majority law changes to identify the causal effects of the pill. They do control for abortion legalization in their analysis, but that's not the focus of their paper. So what is age of majority? Just real quick, this is when the legal system recognizes someone as an adult. In many states, prior to changes in age of majority, it was 21. Why 21? This is from the English common law. There's very many stories of why English common law is 21, not the focus of our topic today. So why did the age of majority change in the US? This is largely attributed to pressure related to the Vietnam War. In federal elections, only people aged 21 and older were allowed to vote. However, soldiers ages 18 to 20 were being drafted into the service. And so this created some political pressure, which led to reducing the legal voting age to 18 in many states, and age of majority as well. Now, I've never seen someone argue that these ages were reduced so that people could access abortion or the pills. So we can think that probably on its face, it's probably an exogenous source of variation to identify fertility effects. So Golden and Katz, they were the first to identify this for use to identify these causal impacts. And I think a lot of the literature that follows in some way or another is using this when they're looking at people younger than 21. As far as what they find, one interesting facet of their paper is that their focus is on college-educated women. So women likely to be college educated. For this group, they find that pill use increases. So in 1971, and why 71, there's very few data sets that ask this question during this time period. And so, especially of teens. So in 1971, 6.5% of 15 to 19-year-olds had ever taken the pill. And of those who are sexually active, the number is 24.5%. So there were young people using the pill. The big finding of their paper, what they focus a lot of effort on, is looking at career investments, and they show that career investment shifted pretty dramatically. So if you look at, in 1960, very small numbers of women are investing in medicine, law, dentistry, MBA, very low fraction of post BA type careers. And then we see this start to really accelerate up from the late 60s on. And it has flattened somewhat in later years, but of course that's a topic for a different day. The other finding they examined was, if people are investing more in their career, maybe they're simultaneously shifting their age of marriage. So delaying marriage to first invest in schooling that will propel a career. And so they looked at the probability that an individual is married by age 23, and they see, people are less likely to get married early. So, thinking back to, the median age of first marriage in 1967 was 20.3. And so, not getting married by 23, that was probably pretty uncommon in the late 60s. And this this starts to be more common, particularly among the college-minded individuals. When they control for abortion laws, they actually find similar effects, and if anything, maybe even slightly larger effects. In this paper, they didn't look at fertility directly, and so that led to some literature that looks at fertility effects. First, I'm going to talk about a paper that used abortion legalization to look at fertility effects. Ingris and Evans find that abortion legalization led to declines in teen fertility and non-marital fertility. For the pill, Bailey picked up right after Golden and Katz, and she looked at fertility and labor effects for ever married women who are married by age 35. And in her study, she does two things, right? She looks at fertility, and she also doesn't restrict the sample to be college-educated women, so it's a broader sample. She is restricted to looking at ever married women due to the nature of the questions, only asking information at certain points in time to people if they were married or had had a child. So it kind of limits what you're able to do. Nevertheless, she finds that legal access to the pill and abortion both decreased first birth before age 22. And here she's using age-restricted access to the pill. She also finds that access to the pill increased labor force participation on both the extensive, so more likely to work, and intensive, working more hours, margins. I have a paper that kind of followed up a bit on this. I used a different data set. I used the vital statistics data. So this is nice because instead of having to be restricted to ever married women, I can look at contemporaneous measures of fertility. And in this paper, I focused on women less than 20 at the time of conception. And I find that legal access to abortion and the pill both decreased age at first birth, with the largest reductions for first births to unmarried women. And I believe the different, well, one more difference, Bailey is using sort of a longer set of cohorts, I would say, for, how can I say, she's able to look at completed fertility, which she finds does not change. In my paper, since I'm looking at a snapshot of births in each year, I'm unable to determine whether these women that I'm looking at these young ages, what happens to their completed fertility. So it's kind of looking at a similar question through different lenses. And then more recently, Caitlin Myers re-examines this time period. She updated the legal coding for both access to abortion and the pill, validating prior work with additional sources and showing, different codings have different mistakes made. In any event, she looks at analysis using the CPS data and the census data. So it's combining a bit what Martha Bailey did, as well as what Golden and Katz had done with the census data. And she comes to the conclusion that there's pretty dramatic fertility and labor force changes, but she attributes these mainly to being due to access to abortion and not as much access to the pill. As far as this, I think she has a recent article on the Journal of Population Economics, I believe, and it provides a really nice discussion of the different laws and policy changes during this time period, all the way through 2020. So I think, it's good to know lot of what's going on. With regard to fertility, since I'm focusing sort of on these younger ages, I think it's important to notice that at different ages, there appear to be different inflection points. So if we look at age 14, for example, it looks like maybe the birth rate was drifting upward all the way through 1972, and it's only for births that were conceived in 1973 that we start to see a drift downward. Something similar maybe for age 15. You see it at 16, but maybe just a little bit less so. And then things start to change for age 17. And then when I put up the older group, 18 and older, you see kind of a really different pattern than say 14. So the shift appears to come very early, and especially for age 20. So I think kind of thinking that different things might be happening for people at different points. I think that's important. These women potentially were more likely to have been married, and even at 17, potentially more likely to be married and giving birth. So I think thinking about the Griswold decision, how that overlays with the timing of abortion, I think this might matter. As far as what I showed you before, I mean, most of that evidence, Golden and Cass and the Bailey, Guldi, Myers, right? This is all trying to get at causal relationships. There's a few other fertility outcomes that I think are interesting that I can't really provide causal evidence of for a variety of reasons. But one question is, what do we think happened with regard to fertility intention? Are pregnancies less likely to be unintended, and births, are they less likely to be unintended? One thing that's tricky in this time period is it's really, well, I mean, even in contemporary times, it's pretty difficult to measure unplanned pregnancies and births. To do this, often researchers require a measure of conception, abortion, miscarriage, and births. Is someone pregnant? If they are pregnant, did they miscarry? If they didn't miscarry, did they have an abortion? If they didn't have an abortion, then did they give a birth? Right. And so this requires a heavy lift on the data side. Complicating things even further is that during this time period, a lot of data sets do not include any information on a lot of these decisions for women who were young, right, younger than 21 sometimes, if they were unmarried. And so even, I believe in some data sets, even if a woman had given birth, they don't ask about her birth if she's too young or unmarried. And so that's complicated. And then in addition to that, if we look at abortion data, it was, reliable data really wasn't available prior to decriminalization of abortion. And so it makes it really complicated to try to look at intention. And so what I'm going to offer is some descriptive evidence. This is a figure from a paper I wrote with Martha and Brad. And one thing that was interesting is if we look at childlessness, right? So the likelihood that a woman reports never having had children, the variation goes down when we get to the post-1960 era. So what you can notice is, fertility is pro-cyclical. And so, 1950 was kind of the good times. And so, we had about 10% of women reporting never having had a child. People who were 20 in 1930, right, more economically constrained time, we see that there's a higher fraction of women who report never having had a child. The other thing that we see is that over this time period, there's a shift to a two-child norm. And so this blue line here it's the 1940 birth cohort. And so this is people who would have been 20 in 1960. So that's right when the pill comes out. Many of these women might have already been married. So maybe this leads them to, be more likely to stop earlier than maybe some of their older cohorts. If we look to those who are 20 in 1970, just a decade later, and then you can see, right, the people 20 in 1970, all the way up to people 20 in 1989, they're basically right on top of each other, with most people having 2 children. And so, I would argue this is evidence that after 1960, something shifted with regard to either people's desired fertility or their ability to meet their fertility. And, given the evidence I'm showing today, I would suggest it probably has more to do with access to reproductive control than other things. As far as career and education and employment, Guldi and Katz started this out. Bailey followed it up. And then in later work, she uses the National Survey of Young Women. She finds that the pill led to increases in educational attainment, as well as earnings at age 30 and 40. And so this is kind of, the first step towards thinking about, what happens over the life course. Lindo has a paper that uses an entirely different data set, sort of looking towards what happens with health and retirement, or with what happens as women age. And they find that an increase in educational attainment. I will say it's a bit sensitive to coding. However, when they look at earnings, they find there's an increase in Social Security covered earnings at younger ages, at the 20s and 30s. They find this is true, not just for the pill, but also for this access to abortion. And I will say they're using, I believe, Myers code here. But they don't find that there's a change in hourly wages at age 50s, right? So whether that means women start dropping out of the labor force, or if it means the effects fade out, presumably maybe after women start having children, it's hard to know from this study. But I think this is an area that's interesting. Next, I want to think about what happens to, potentially behavioral changes. So Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz have this paper in 1996, and they present a model that suggests that the pill may have led to changes in bargaining power of young women. And so maybe, with this shift, if there may be a group of women who use the pill and a group of women who don't use the pill, and because this is kind of a market, it leads to young women who aren't using the pill maybe less likely to get married if they end up becoming pregnant. And so there's a paper, Beauchamp and Pakaluk, I'm sorry if I'm saying her names wrong. They find that non-marital births actually increased due to access to the pill. And so this would be evidence consistent with the Akerlof prediction. The other paper kind of that goes along with this is some work by Click and Stratman. They find that sexually transmitted diseases increased with abortion legalization, right? So in both cases, these suggest, right, there's maybe different things happening in different groups regarding who's at risk and, what are maybe some other health effects that we might want to consider. So this kind of leads into a really important insight, thinking about the potential compositional changes of who is, who we're observing if we're looking at births, and what's happening maybe over time, depending on how this composition might change. And so, when we think about selection, I teach health economics, so I always think about, who's selected into buying health insurance. And so this is a concept that was applied when thinking about, if you have a new technology like the pill, or if you have a change in laws that change access to abortion or the pill, how does that affect costs that people may face? And then do different people weigh those costs differently when they're making their economic decisions related to fertility, career, et cetera, et cetera? And so there's two papers I think that maybe encapsulate this the best. So Ananot et al. In 2009, they look at abortion and selection. And then Ananot and Hungerman look at this more related to the pill. And so for the pill, they find different effects if you're looking at the short run versus if you're thinking of the long run. So in the short run, they find, like other work has found that fertility goes down when the pill is introduced. But when they look at the characteristics of infants born, they see an increase in low birth weight, and they see an increase in the percentage of children, right? The fraction of children born into a house of low income is going up, right? So it seems like maybe some negative selection in who we observe being born around the time of birth. So this is consistent with the Beauchamp and Pakaluk story. So their results, I think, could fit either in a market story like the Akerlof model, or it could fit more into a selection story. I mean, they're related, but you can kind of think of it either way. Okay, so as far as what they find for the long run, it's a bit different. So they don't find much on the margin of completed fertility changing. So this suggests, maybe fertility goes down in the short run, but over time, people end up having around the same number of children. So it shifts the timing of birth to later. The other thing that's interesting is they find that there's an increase in the fraction of children with college-educated mothers and a decrease in the fraction of children with divorced mothers. And so this suggests that, the children, right, there's a delay, and the delay is perhaps used to make educational investments, and maybe these kids that end up being born are born into better resourced families. For abortion, the evidence, especially for the Ananot et al. 2009 paper, is mainly using abortion legalization. So in the short run, they find a decrease in fertility, and they actually find infants who are born after abortion legalization have improved or better observed characteristics. So for example, there's a decrease in the fraction that are low birth weight. In the long run, they find for this group, there's actually increase in educational attainment. And so, in some, it looks like maybe there are different things happening if someone's accessing the pill versus accessing abortion. Maybe different groups are being affected. Next, I'm going to present just this paper. This working paper just came out, I think it was in December, and they re-examine this time period and they look at maternal mortality. I think the working paper is like 100 pages long, so I'm probably not doing it complete justice here, but they do find that abortion legalization and the reforms just prior led to a drop in non-white mortality on the order of 30 to 40%. They are using the Myers coding, so I think that's pretty interesting. One of the big kind of takeaways is that for abortion, it doesn't really seem to affect maternal mortality for white women, but it has a pretty dramatic effect for non-white women. I think this is interesting, in particular for the current environment. Some statistics just came out recently that the maternal mortality in the US increased by 9 deaths per 1,000 women between 2020 and 2021, a 30% increase. The maternal mortality rate was, I mean, it's high in the US, but this was a really dramatic increase. And so I'm not sure kind of what the lesson is here, but I think this is a metric that we probably will be paying attention to going forward. As far as infant mortality, this is something I think people looked at a bit more carefully for, since the time abortion was legalized. But I think the first paper that kind of tries to analyze this in an economic way is Grossman and Jacobitz and Jacobowitz, sorry. They use abortion legalization, and they find, so they look at a number of policies that might affect infant mortality, and they find almost nothing else matters in their regression. The only thing that matters is the increase in legal abortion rate, and they call it the single most factor in reductions in both white and non-white neonatal mortality rates. So, I mean, Medicaid was rolled out during this period. The public family planning services were rolled out during their period. Maternal and infant care projects, right? So they find effects of these other things, but they're completely dwarfed by what they attribute to the legalization of abortion. Subsequent work looks at infant mortality and arrives at very similar conclusions. But as more evidence is collected, it suggests maybe the effects are a bit more salient for non-white infant mortality, and maybe for younger women. So age and race seem to matter a bit more in this context. As far as other outcomes, childhood outcomes have been considered. And so what is this? Well, if you have a child before or after one of these policies is adopted, if they're born into better circumstances, maybe they'll be less likely to experience, diminished childhood outcomes. And so Donahue and Levitt looked at crime as an outcome, and they basically said that abortion legalization led to the drop in crime 18 years later. This was given some pushback by Joyce just a few years later in a couple of papers. Joyce's idea was, well, this is due to the crack cocaine epidemic, and it's not really due to abortion legalization. But really what kind of threw water on this as an outcome is this paper by Foote and Getz, and they show that all the effects go away. It seems to have been due to mainly a coding error. So I don't know, maybe there is an effect on crime, but I wasn't, after reading all this literature a decade ago, I think people don't think it's such a big deal. There is a paper that does suggest that infants born after the repeal of abortion laws are less likely to use substances. So alcohol, illegal drugs, et cetera. So this would be supportive of the positive selection story. I haven't seen anything updating this question, so it's always kind of open. Last, Bittler and Marian Bittler and Madeline Savny, they look at adoption, and they are looking at it from the perspective of abortion laws, and they look at the ALI, the reform, and then they look at the repeal, so the full-on repeal of criminality of abortion. And they find different effects based on the race of the women. For the ALI reform, they find adoption rates to non-white women decrease. And for white women, they find they decrease after Roe. They decrease, with the pre-reform repeals. Either way, these numbers are pretty dramatic. And so this is something I think we may want to think about in the current context. Last is thinking about longer term outcomes. So career investments happen. So if someone decides to delay fertility, to invest in schooling and invest in career, some of those benefits maybe aren't seen immediately, right? So they're much longer outcomes to consider. And so in the wake of greater access to abortion and pill access, a lot of these authors have found the effects persist into adulthood. And so looking at outcomes of the children who were born and what kind of education do they receive, they're more likely to be educated, they're less likely to have single rates of parenthood, lower rates of public assistance. And so I think this is just something to keep in mind, that there's kind of like a long shadow of these policies. As far as future work is concerned, I think there are some questions that we can still ask that maybe we just haven't been able to answer quite yet. And maybe someone who's clever can come up with a good way to answer. But I think one of the questions is sort of a household economics question, which is what has happened to match quality? And so does access to reproductive control, broadly defined, lead to better match quality? Some evidence suggests that pill access leads to a lower likelihood of divorce. But I'd be interested to see if this alters how couples match. And so I think that would be something that would be of use, thinking about kind of longer term outcomes of the family. There's economic research that suggests how low stress the family is might affect child environment, which might affect long-term outcomes. And so I think there's multiple potential mechanisms for seeing kind of longer run outcomes that we haven't explored. We also probably could learn more about the financial circumstances of the woman and the potential kids throughout the life course. So does access to reproductive control lead to improved retirement outcomes? This is something I think that a couple of authors have kind of tried to scratch the surface on. So Bailey, Hirschman Miller, and Lindo, they look at wages and they see that wages do increase for women who were exposed to these policies. But what happens later, right? So what does it change the retirement age? Does it change how much wealth a family can accumulate? Does it change the health of the women later in life? Does it change how women claim Social Security benefits? Certainly before this time period, when the husband is the breadwinner, many women are claiming based on their husband's earnings. And so I think some of these cohorts haven't even fully reached claiming age. We're getting there, we're almost there. But I think that's an interesting kind of longer term question to think about. And so I think maybe stay tuned. I've been interested in that question for a while. Maybe someone will get to it before me. Some other things that I didn't discuss today that I just was pretty sure I would run out of time on. I think there's some pushback, right? So with the pill in particular, there were some safety scares. It's important to highlight that the pill was approved prior to the thalidomide scare. The thalidomide scare led to something called drug amendments of 1962, which made it much more difficult for any drug to get through the FDA drug approval process. And so there were issues related to blood clots in the 70s, but also more contemporaneous different methods of oral or patch birth control. There have been issues with that. So I think thinking about like safety scares and how that might interact with the other decisions. And then of course, the rollback of the legalization on the abortion front, there's research already discussed in this series, looking at Casey, looking at the more recent TRAP laws. And then, of course, it's an open question what's going to happen in the wake of the Dobbs decision. So I think those are areas of future concern. So today I talked about what happens to women's fertility, education, career, labor force participation, health. Overall, it looks like women's fertility decreases. Maybe they achieve more education. The children appear, in many cases, to arrive in a better resourced environment, which could be important for long-term outcomes. If we look at the effects, the timing of the effects appear to be different for the pill versus abortion, and by individual circumstances, race, age, and I think there's a lot to be learned still regarding the later effects. And I think all of this can really be used to inform current debate. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Rebecca, do you have some questions or comments?
Well, I found the presentation very clear, and I took many notes. I wonder if you can share your PowerPoint with us, because I think all the reference that you have with the specific years, for me, it seems like your presentation allows us to better understand like the debate from the very first article and on these topics, and also something that is difficult to understand, and I think you help a lot, is to make the link between the debate on contraception and abortion, because many people say no, it's totally different, and it's not connected, and we hope that this acceptation that we have today, when we talk about contraception, one day we can have when we talk about abortion. But I think your presentation and your research help us to make this connection between these two topics. My question was more about like the role that you think economists have is like in the public sphere, it's like the impact of all these articles that you present, because maybe in academics, for people who are working on this, on contraception or on abortion as you, for the specialists, all this literature is very well known, but I wonder if this literature is really discussed among other academic economists, and also how this can, jump to the public sphere, to dialogue with lawyers, doctors, or or even people that are really in power in the United States.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I'll just talk about my personal views. So I live in a state that's pretty restrictive on what I can advocate for professionally. So, I can't really say I should do any advocating from a professional standpoint, given that I'm working in the state of Florida. I'll just leave that there. I do think even before I worked in Florida, I always took the view, and not everyone agrees with me. I'm not an advocate of one way or the other. I feel like if I try to be an advocate, then I'm only looking for one answer when I go look at data. When I try to answer, I have a hypothesis, I'm going to be looking for one answer. So I like to just do the analysis and see what it tells me. So I think I don't know, that's kind of where I am on that. I actually didn't sign the amicus brief, just in part because it's my philosophy that I don't think I should be pushing things one way or another. And I know different people have different perspectives. Caitlin, I think, is much more in the advocating sphere, and I think she made a conscious decision based on things I've heard her say in public domains. So I think people have different approaches. My approach is, I don't feel like I'm burying my head in the sand, but I think I'm just I don't choose to be an advocate one way or the other. I also feel something that wasn't really touched on, but something that one of my colleagues not here, but one of my peer colleagues is interested in is thinking about, and this is more like in the health sphere, I guess, infant health, infant mortality, and then thinking about, at what point do we think of infant health? And then once you cross the threshold prior to birth, right, we care about prenatal care, right? But then how do we value like mom's health versus fetus health? And how does that relate to infant health? So I think there's a lot to unpack. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
I think one of the interesting things about all these discussions is how a lot of the conversation is really the same as it has been in the past. The economists who are working on like women's rights and contraception in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, and balancing scientific objectivity with policy advocacy was a challenge that they faced. And what was the appropriate role of particularly academic economists, right, as they were coming into university positions. The other thing that really struck me was the discussion of infant mortality rates, because that's where I think a lot of like the Victorians were like horrified, right? You have these middle and upper class Victorians who are now wandering into the slums of London, and they're seeing the state in which really poor families live and child mortality rates. And that's one of the first things they start to try to measure to see about a population health is infant mortality rates. And the numbers you showed were shocking. It's amazing that we accept, live with those sorts of mortality rates today, for mothers and for infants. It's quite shocking.
I think the evidence for maternal mortality is probably, it's done using the most recent econometric innovations that applied microeconomists have at the moment. And so even compared to all of the other evidence I presented, that's probably, it's still a working paper, but it seems like, a lot, it would suggest if we put all of the other work through the more modern econometric framework, we'd probably find something similar. I will say I didn't see, and it might just be I'm not seeing it in my review, but I haven't seen, beyond what's been done in 99. I haven't seen any updates on looking at infant mortality, and it seems like that would be a really interesting thing to look at, especially given so much was happening. So the slide I showed you, I don't remember if I put this all on there. So yeah, I don't think I have it all on here, but during this period, like in the 70s, 60s, 70s, there was big innovations in infant ICU care. So the neonatal intensive care units, they figured out what worked to help keep these infants alive. And so there's like a big health innovation that happens on top of all of this. And I feel like maybe this is a question that merits some more examination. There's also kind of this black-white gap in infant mortality that changes pretty dramatically from 1960 to 1980. And so just layering that on top of all of this, I think it's just something I don't think that has been really carefully analyzed. Yeah. So I agree. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any more comments or questions or complaints?
Hopefully not. So, yeah, I'll be happy to send these slides to you and Rebecca and Marianne.
Oh, super.
All right.
Thank you.
All right,
All
I'm
right.
gonna
Thank
stop
you very much.
recording. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank